Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ben Tomczyk on behalf of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget and FixUS. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. We're really excited for today's panel discussion of the documentary Unrepresented. Before we begin, just a few housekeeping items. The first thing you'll notice is we are recording, and the second is we're live streaming over Facebook. Additionally, the film may be titled Unrepresented, but we want to make sure you're represented in this conversation. I know, pardon the pun. So to do that, we encourage you to please submit your questions using the question and answer feature at the bottom of your screen. If you would like to direct your question to a specific panelist, please make sure to note that when you're submitting the Q&A. Again, we're really excited to have everyone. I think this is such a cool event, and it's so rare that we get to do something like get an advanced screening of a documentary and then talk with the filmmakers and the subject matter experts. So I'm going to dive right into it. The film is, as I'm sure you all know, the documentary is Unrepresented. It explores why Washington is broken and what can be done about it. And to help dig into these issues, we have an excellent panel for you. So I'm going to go left to right on my screen. The first is Maya MacGuineas, who is the president of the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget and the founder of FixUS. Next is Kahlil, or KB Byrd, who is the founder and CEO of Invest America. We then have Andrew Rodney, who is the executive producer of Unrepresented. And we are expected to be joined by Professor Lawrence Lessig, who is the he is the Roy L. Furman Professor of Law and Leadership at Harvard Law School, the founder of Equal Citizens, and the author of America Compromised and They Don't Represent Us. We expect him to be joining us any minute, but I figure we have so much to talk about, so let's dive in. Andrew, I want to start with you. First off, let me offer my congratulations. I saw the film Monday night. It is wonderful, and I'd really like to ask, what was the inspiration for the film? Was there a moment? Was there a movement? Was there something that happened? And what do you hope audiences take away from it, knowing that we're viewing it at the end of a year that has seen a global pandemic, an economic downturn, and a bitterly divisive presidential election?
Oh, thank you for the question, Ben, and thank you, CRFB, for hosting this. Good discussion and the screening of the film. Kahlil for joining, and hopefully Dr. Lessig as well, and Maya. The film started where the last film that the director Daniel and I ended, which was after making a documentary about Detroit and the problems that city where we were both born has faced. We found that a lot of the problems that it was dealing with were stemming from the federal government and Congress in particular in their actions that were just causing problems. I'll use one example which doesn't make it into the film, but the war on drugs and the way that the war on drugs has been prosecuted in this country. That was, in studying it in the local effects and wanting to kind of make a local impact in our community, we saw the devastating effects of the government's, again, the war on drugs. We saw that there's been more than, at this point, 23,000 murders in Detroit since 1969, mass incarceration, and with very little benefit to show for it. And yet it's a policy that has continued and continues to this day with some modification. And that program, even though it doesn't make economic sense, continues because special interests have such influence in stopping legislation. So those who want it cause it to persist, even though it doesn't make economic sense to do. So we in studying that, I left that project and wanting to figure out how it is that we bring more sense and more balance to our federal government's decisions. And after a while of kind of studying the how things look at the federal level, Daniel and I felt that there was further education to be done. And to answer your question about what we're hoping to come out of this, It is really just that further education. When I was, after making that last film, I spent a period just trying to get involved and see how I could make a difference. But I found that there is such a divide out there that exists between people wanting to make a difference and understanding, how they can make how they can make a difference, but then also having an understanding of how they make that difference, and the people feeling that they have to work against each other rather than with each other. That people who want a responsible federal budget are somehow have to put their priorities ahead of working to reform campaign finance reform, when the attitude really needs to be that we all have to work together on these things, which is part of the reason that a big focus of the film is this corruption cycle, where we talk about a mutual reinforcing system, and you can't fight that system by just attacking one part of it. You have to collectively go after it. And I appreciate the FixUS campaign and the attempt that FixUS and CRFB are making to do just that and kind of continue that discussion. So happy to be a part of this.
Thanks, Andrew. Maya, KB, I'm going to direct the next question to both of you. So much of the film is dedicated to the amount of money we have in our politics and the brokenness of our politics. We've had money in politics for a long time. I mean, you go back to the robber barons, you go back to Standard Oil, money's always been in politics. We've also had moments in our country where our politics has been broken. The question I have for both of you is, why is this moment different? Why does this moment feel different? And why should we be more concerned now than we ever have been before?
Sorry about that Zoom etiquette. Think about 2016, where we spent, well, before I start there, let me congratulate Andrew. It was actually like watching an old friends reel of people we've worked with over the long period of time on these hugely important issues. And I'm just encouraging everyone to both watch it and have any of their friends and family watch it. This is an important piece of work to look at right now. In 2016, we as a country spent $7 billion on House, Senate, and presidential races. This year, it's cresting to 14 billion, doubled the amount on those races, and Georgia's not even finished. What the sector did really well was it reacted to an emergency in our politics, and that was the idea of having a vote that represented everyone and that fulfilled the promise, even though there were people who were down talking the idea of having a strong election all the way through. Despite that, people who in the space of democracy reform, who are working on all sorts of things, focused on mail and other ways of getting people out to vote. So this is a huge success. The reason why this is an important moment is the attention is on this issue. Republicans, Democrats, and independents cannot get past the idea that our democracy is decaying, is in trouble, can be lost, and that it's our responsibility to fix it. And the community of people who are focusing on it is much wider than it normally would be, and we have to capitalize on this moment.
I will jump in. Will you just give me the sign that you can hear me? Okay, great. First, a couple things. First, I will say, I really think this documentary is excellent. And I'm so glad we're able to host this and do an event like this. I only wish we could have sent popcorn out to everybody who is watching with us, so that it felt like a real movie preview, as we want to do. But I think it does a remarkable job of showing all the interrelated problems in both a kind of nuanced, sophisticated, and accessible way. And so I think it's going to be really effective. So far, everybody who's watched it, we've had rave reviews. Two quick things also. super sorry for my background. I know I look like what Room Raider would describe as a hostage situation, and you'll probably see my entire house tour before the event is over because our Wi-Fi, it's just over. And third, welcome to my colleague, Ben, who has been the host of our great webinars for the past year into his big moderating event. He is a great host of all these events. So I think this is a really cool event. I also think it's a really important topic, and to build on what KB and Andrew were saying, listen, this moment is kind of, we are not finished the ongoing slide we have of dysfunction and division and distrust in this country. And that's why we've moved out of just focusing on fiscal issues, which is what I talk about in the documentary, into these much broader political issues, which I think the documentary does a phenomenal job of showing how they are interwoven. But this is a moment where the failure of our political system to function and the failure of our economic system to deliver outcomes and results that people are continuing to see as fair, and the failure of our institutions to create trust in the citizens who are a part of this system is just falling into one tremendous mess. And I would say the final level, the final input of technology and kind of a frictionless disinformation environment is allowing all those things to get worse at warp speed. And so this is a moment where I think everybody's kind of lost their footing for the past years, no matter what side you're on politically, or no side, and you feel ideologically homeless like a lot of us involved in this do. But it just feels like things are getting worse, and it's actually leading citizens to feel helpless and not with any venue or approach to help make things better. And what I like about the documentary is it really takes these issues of money and influence, lobbying, influence. It shows how the lack of fiscal constraint kind of opens the checkbook to exacerbate the misuse of influence. And it shows them in a way that feels like an open system. You can see what's going wrong, but it's also not completely hopeless. It leaves you with a sense of, okay, here are different approaches that we can, as citizens, take to get a handle on these problems. And so I think it's a terrible moment for the country. There's no sugarcoating it. 2020, you add the virus into the already polarized environment, and it's just a year that we are all exhausted from. Again, no matter who you wanted to win the election, how you feel about politics. But the problem is, it's not going to fix itself. 2021 is not going to be a perfect year of harmony and unity again in this country. And we have a lot of work to do. And what I like is breaking apart some of the specific things that we can do, deal with money in politics, for instance, and undue influence, to get a grip on that, but also showing it's a part of a bigger kind of sick ecosystem that we're going to have to work really hard at all the different parts that are fueling into that. So that's why I think it's such an important film, and I think it's going to hit at the right moment.
Thanks, Maya. And just a reminder to everybody, you have till midnight tonight to view the film. We hope you watch it if you haven't already. Let me follow up, Maya, on something you said, and I want to tease our audience. I know some of these topics are heavy. I promise we're going to get to an optimistic note a little bit later on. But when we look at sort of the failures of all of our systems, and I'm directing this to our whole panel here, is it a failure of government? Is it a failure of policymakers? Is it a failure of our citizens? And are the reform efforts we see towards the second half of the documentary, at all the reform efforts, Andrew, you mentioned, are these meeting the moment? Let's see who wants to take that one first.
I'll jump in. I think that it's of course it's collective. Any questions, that's usually is it this or that. It's some mix of both. And I think the U.S. is in many ways a victim of its own success in the post-war era. So the first documentary that Daniel and I made was about the city of Detroit. In the 1950s, Detroit was highest standards of living in the nation. And 60, 70 years later now, it's some of the lowest. And coming out in that era, it seemed like we couldn't lose. So we adopted a lot of policies that had long-term consequences. And to speak to the fiscal responsibility angle, when the U.S. left World War II and we had an endless, credit card called the reserve currency, and we were just able to endlessly deficit spend. And I'm gonna step back. I'll use an example here of irresponsible policies going back to kind of this drug war, which I know it's not a big feature of the film, but in the local level, which was our main motivation to make an impact, that comes up again and again. So the war on drugs started. It started before 1970, but that's when Nixon passed the Drug Control Act. Alcohol prohibition, which had the exact same kind of consequences and impacts, was done after 13 years, and because it had the same consequences and impacts and costs. After 1970, 13 years after 1970, Ronald Reagan was president. Mr. Limited Government, and did he, respond to the ever-rising costs and murder rates and by stopping this policy? No, he didn't have to. He was just able to create more, more billions of more dollars and extend our government in all different areas and not look at what the cost-benefit analysis was of anything. And in fact, the political incentives are to never look at those cost benefits because, not never, but really, just because the incentive is always to create more and more money. And that's a path that we've been on, and it's just accelerated and accelerated. And the influence buying that's so not to go too far, but I think we're kind of a victim of our own success, and now the system has just gotten so, it's been going wrong for so long that where did it start? It's hard to answer, and I think that it's not politics. It's a combination of politics and community, but the political system is it's foreign to most people. We're all steeped in it a little bit. If you're watching this documentary, you have some interest, but most people don't care that much. And I do think that more people have to pay attention and fix the political system. I think that's where, while our communities are ultimately where everything comes from, and that's where the solutions will come from. We have to focus on our communities first. We have to reform. We have to be focused on fixing our communities, and then at the same time, fixing this political system before it's too late.
I would agree with that answer. The answer being it's both. And it also means that the solutions are both going to have to be bottom up and top down. And that's why, as there's this whole new kind of field of different organizations and groups that are working on these issues coming up, there's as many strategies and operational approaches to how we're going to deal with these problems as there are problems themselves. Because you can say, what is the single biggest change that we could make to our election system that might improve things? And that will do one piece, but you'd be ignoring the cultural tensions between different people of different ideologies, backgrounds. Or you could say, let's change the whole way that we work through civic education, but you'd still ignore that there's all these incentives within the systems that lead politicians having to fundraise with the bulk of their time, or live in ideological partisan camps instead of working more collaboratively. So I'd say, here's two huge systemic problems I see. The first is the role and the influence of parties. And I should say many experts disagree with me and see it as the opposite. They see that the parties are no longer strong enough and don't serve as strong enough gatekeepers or disciplinarians of members of Congress. But I, and probably because I am an independent and find it somewhat lonely. They're not that lonely. Many actually independents are out there. We just don't have a real way to play as a part of the game. But the power of the parties, I think, is incredibly destructive in that the incentives are to keep problems alive and often not to compromise. The really good news is it looks like we're about to have a bipartisan compromise on the next economic recovery package. And that is terrific, and big applause to the members of Congress who are leading on that effort, because that's the kind of game changer that we need. But I'll still point out from a fiscal perspective, it's easier to come up with a bipartisan deal when you're borrowing $900 billion than when you're actually doing something, and we should be borrowing right now. Let me be really clear. This is exactly what we need to be doing. It's the moment for borrowing. As someone who works on fiscal responsibility, I just say borrow right now. but that's why we shouldn't have been borrowing before leading up to this moment. And that's why we'll have to focus on fiscal issues once we get out of this downturn. But as good as it is to see bipartisan compromise, it's a lot easier to do it when you are borrowing money. And again, I think the film does such a good job of showing how the lack of constraint means there's no hurdles to decide whether something's worth it. There's no pressure to decide how you want to allocate your constrained dollars, because if you have the printing press or the ability to borrow, you don't feel constrained. But the real question will be, how can you do bipartisanship once those stakes are a little bit harder and higher? And we haven't seen the party leadership wanting to do that. In fact, they want to keep problems live so that they can run on them in the next election. Probably the best example in our country is Social Security reform. Social Security is something we have known for decades is on a path where the trust funds aren't going to have enough money to pay the promised benefits. And yet there's massive infighting, disagreement about not touching Social Security. You have both parties now under the leadership of Donald Trump. Republicans joined Democrats who've been more likely to not talk about entitlement reform for a while, talking about not doing anything, when the clear truth is you have to do something about this issue. The question is what? And that's where we should have the rich disagreements. There's many ways to fix Social Security. Let's figure out how. But the fact is political leadership actually would prefer we not talk about it. So the desire to keep those issues live for elections, fight about them, deny the other party a win, especially if you think you might be able to take back the majority, all of those things, in my mind, means partisanship is contributing to the dysfunction. The second systemic failure I would just mention is, I think, we're now saying we have democracy and we have capitalism, our political system and our economic system. You now see the outcome of capitalism where it's very high income inequality and wealth inequality because of the influence of money in politics creeping into the democracy system. So where the outcomes aren't guaranteed to be the same in our economic system, they're supposed to be equal in our political system. But the unequal outcomes of the economic system are now influencing the political system. So those, I think, are some of the big issues that are top up. We need to change, fix, tweak, improve both our basic tenets of our political and our economic systems. But on the bottom up part, you cannot deny that none of this will work without citizen engagement, that citizens are incredibly unengaged, whether it's voting, knowledge of basic civics, the community threads that held people together and gave us forums to work through these issues, they are all disintegrating. So we're going to have to work on both the levels of how you re-engage citizens in making these decisions in our system of self-government, and how you go ahead and change some of the systems legislatively or through political norms so that the incentives aren't so counterproductive.
So I'll launch off on the incentives conversation and work hard not to repeat the good comments that Andrew and Maya laid out. There are actors in the system who both find it lucrative or convenient to bend the incentives away from the citizen and the ground and the community level and toward power. And I'll name three. There's leadership in the political parties, political consultants, I came out of that community, and philanthropists who in one level are investing in candidates, on the other level are investing in reform. So Maya talked a lot about the political leadership, and I think one of the things that heartens us is that we have a green shoot of bipartisanship in this COVID bill, which is imperfect, but that's what compromise is. And so what we hope in 2021 is that we see more of that, and we create more opportunities for agreement and compromise that help people then go the other way. Look, political advisors were a significant part, first of all, of increasing the spending that you see in campaigns, which is just an arms race, but also creating incentives that made it a negative act to pass a second COVID bill this year, or compromise on other things. The best political advice that someone would be paid for was to have people who were Democrats or Republicans do nothing before the election, which has pressed us to the wall. And what we're seeing are people going out of business, the small businesses. We're seeing evictions go up, and we're seeing people in food lines for the first time in their lives So there is a direct result, and I think that people are paying attention to that, which is why you saw so many people come out to vote. And it is well understood. People like Rob Stein and others have done studies which show that we are underfinanced severely in the democracy reform movement, and that we have to make sure that we have, for those organizations that continue to improve their process, connect their work to regular people, and win both on reforms and with people, that they need more resources. And so what we would hope to see are, in an era where money is everywhere in politics and has hit every crack, that more of those dollars, more of that focus goes to really great investments in the democracy reform space that can move the needle.
So we have a bunch of audience questions, and I want to jump into them real quickly. Okay, we've talked about the problem. We've talked about what led us here, why this moment is unique. We have an audience of viewers out there who are watching this, and one of the questions they're asking, and it looks like we're just joined by Professor Lawrence Lessig, who is the professor of law, the Roy L. Furman Professor of Law and Leadership at Harvard. Professor Lessig, thank you for joining us.
I am so sorry that I'm late. I missed the time on my calendar, so I apologize.
No problem. We're just about to jump into audience questions, and before we do, maybe I'd like to pose a question to you, if you don't mind. We've been talking about sort of the moment we're in right now, and we've had issues of broken politics before, of money in politics before. Love to get your take on what makes this moment unique to you, and why we as a country really need to change the direction in which we're going.
Well, I think in some ways it's the best of times, and in some ways the worst of times. So it's the best of times because, astonishingly in 2020, we had every single major candidate for president on the Democrat side and one Republican who committed to fundamental reform of our political system within the first 100 days of their administration. Of course, premised on the Democrats controlling in a significant way Congress, but still the idea that we had this universal commitment to pass H.R. 1 was really astonishing. The challenge is, obviously, we have a divided government. This is the worst of times part, assuming, hopefully Georgia goes the other way, but even if Georgia does vote blue, it still will be a very tenuous majority in the Senate, which means it'll be very difficult to move any of these extraordinary proposals through Congress. And so we still haven't built enough support in Congress to be able to assure the passage of such reform. And that's going to take more work to convince people, especially of the need for public funding of campaigns. But I think we've made enormous progress in just 5 years, and I think that's a reason to be hopeful.
Can I jump in with one thought building on that? Because I think one of the big challenges in all of this is that the people who are being regulated in many of these reforms are the lawmakers. And it's just like you have a hard time getting industries to change their own behavior. So much of the unfair incentives aren't R versus D, they are favoring incumbents. And that's certainly true when it comes to money. And so there is a piece of this, back to the previous question about, is this top down, is this bottom up, where are the changes going to come from, which is we are going to have to engage citizens enough. And I think they're angry about corruption. I think that's one thing you can certainly get bipartisan agreement on from citizens, but so that they put the pressure on. And it may be that we have to do a lot more outsourcing of the decision-making for the kinds of rules and restrictions that oversee the things that regulate politics, because you can't trust the politicians who have, this kind of unholy alliance when it comes to protecting their incumbencies to make the really deepest reforms we're going to want to see.
Yeah.
So let's stay on that citizen engagement aspect right now. The first question we have comes from Freddie, who writes in, okay, we hear the message, we agree. What can we as citizens do? What would you say?
So everyone on this call has operated as an entrepreneur. Larry Lessig started something called Mayday Pack, which was a big crowdsourcing experiment. I was honored to be on the board of it. It is a part of a style of doing things. Maya created and ran Fix the Debt. And those things started organically over the last 10 years. I'll just give you a short list of potential investments. American Promise, Represent Us, Unite America, Bridge Alliance, Leadership Now, FixUS. These organizations and others have taken an investment approach, vetting ideas, approaches, campaigns around the country. My recommendation would be to connect with one or several of these organizations and really get their list as they develop it over 2021 of the places you should invest in ranked choice voting, in gerrymandering reform, in money in politics reform, and put your dollars there. You should still continue to support candidates that you care about and trust in your schools and your organizations, but these are investments that are improving, and also the process of identifying them is improving.
Yeah, and let me add to that, because one of the things that we did when we were starting FixUS and wanted to understand what was out there on the landscape, what reforms groups existed, is we built a huge landscape review, which is on our FixUS website, which certainly doesn't have all, but has as many as we can keep up with, different organizations in different areas. So pull that up, look at the different groups, add to it if we've missed any, but more specifically, email me if you want to. I mean, I hope that everybody here is a part of FixUS, but email me with the specific area you're interested in. Is it money in politics? Is it civic education? Is it just learning more about all these things? And we will connect you with a couple of the different groups that are out there that are doing different pieces. Because one of the unique and exciting things about this moment is things are so bad that there is no concern that there's not enough space for more groups and more people becoming involved. So I feel like it's a more cooperative, collaborative moment between all the different advocacy groups that are starting up than I've ever seen before. And we're trying to network in different ways. And we want to build people who want to get things done and help make these reforms happen. And so, you know, I know most of you are with FixUS already, but send me your interest and I'll send you a bunch of groups that you might want to look at.
I will drop a chat for anyone who's interested in learning more about FixUS. I'll drop a chat with the link to FixUS and where you can sign up. Rick asks, big focus of the film is on money and politics. Can we ever truly get the money out of politics to the point where we get the needed reforms, or is that just beyond possibility at this point?
So let me start with that. I think first thing is to recognize this framing, money out of politics, it might not be helpful. What we need is representatives who are not dependent on a tiny number of funders so that they feel free to do the right thing. And that's not so much about reducing the amount of money, it's about changing the way they raise money. So some of the most, and discussed in the film, some of the most ambitious changes in the way we fund campaigns are like the Seattle voucher program, which gives every voter vouchers which they can use to help fund campaigns. If every voter had vouchers, you know, and in this last presidential race, there was almost an arms race among candidates. Some saying, you know, Andrew Yang started with a $100 voucher. Kirsten Gillibrand proposed a system that would give you up to $600 if there were 3 federal races that you were running in. And Bernie Sanders rallied at the end to support vouchers. If there were vouchers in the system, the actual amount of money being spent would be greater than the amount of money that's being spent right now. But the critical difference is when people raise money, they would be thinking of the tens of thousands of people who they're raising money from, as opposed to the couple hundred or 1,000 people who they're getting large contributions from, because they wouldn't be getting those large contributions. So the critical thing is to think about the dependence of representatives on an unrepresentative few. That's why the title of the movie, I think, is so fantastic. Dependence on an unrepresentative few, rather than whether there's money to help people understand the problems or the issues that government ought to solve.
I live in New York and we think we're the straw that stirs the drink. So discount what I say based on your understanding. But we have a great experiment that's happening here. We have a mayor's race that's coming up. We have probably 25 to 30 candidates. We have an 8-to-1 public financing match. So how does it work? I give $250 to a candidate who has decided to do public financing. They have to get 999 more of me to give $250, and they will get somewhere in the neighborhood between $3 and $4 million. Now, what do they have to accept? There's a cap on the amount that they can spend in the primary. We also have ranked choice voting here in New York. So the New York City is sort of piling everything into this system. But if we didn't have that public financing match, we wouldn't have the kind of competition and interesting conversation that is happening between moderates, progressives, and others, some people pretty conservative, who are deciding to go after that race. What you have to do is get 1,000 of your fellow New Yorkers to agree that they want to give you $250. We have a challenge at the federal level because Barack Obama, Donald Trump, they decided to ignore the public financing system. So it doesn't really exist on the federal level. I think that there's an argument to bring it back because it would bring competition along with vouchers, what Larry's talking about. It would bring the kind of energy and competition to new candidates that you just don't see if someone, as the film said, is spending 70% of their time calling the regular old role of Democratic or Republican funders.
Thanks, Kahlil. Andrew, George writes in, he said, you take congressional leadership to task in the film. What has the reaction been? Have you heard anything from policymakers who have seen it?
The reaction from policymakers has only been of, I guess, appreciation, understanding. I find that members of Congress and their staffs are some of the most jaded people about the system, having to deal with it every day. They know how much time they're spending fundraising. They know that the system is broken, but they, as Representative Amash in the film, there's not a whole lot that they can do about it. If they're playing, well, I don't want to be overly simplistic, but there's plenty of people who didn't have time to talk for the film, even people who had agreed to talk before the film, that didn't end up having the time to speak because, they might be able, it just wouldn't, it could only do harm to them in some ways to say too much. And but in general, when you're having conversations off camera with these people, they understand what's wrong and they'd like to see a change as well. It's just about their power to fix it.
Thank you.
I think it's true that the system of money and politics is, excuse me. Zoom living. That the system of money and politics is sort of this one system where not a single participant actually likes it, right? So the members of Congress didn't go to Congress because they love fundraising. And if you talk to corporations, businesses that give money all the time, they don't like it. They would much rather have there be rules against it, not even because they care about the money so much. I'm sure they get a great return on their giving, but because they'd rather not be asked and not have to have that system. So this is a system where there is a huge pent up willingness or demand to see changes. But again, it's the level playing field of whoever has the advantage at the moment isn't going to want to give that up and make those reforms at the time for the advantage of the incumbents.
I once had a member describe to me something, this was very depressing. They said, everybody will say we hate raising money, but in a perverse psychological sense, we actually kind of like it. It's kind of like doing push-ups. If you're living in Congress, you're not doing anything anyway. Nothing's getting accomplished. But if you have this little goal that you got to raise $10,000, you've got 2 hours to raise $10,000 and you go and do it and then you hit your goal, there it is, you've done something. You've actually accomplished something in the day. So it's like the one thing at the end of the day you can look back on and think, I actually achieved something. Now that's so freaking depressing that we have representatives who think of their worth literally in dollars and cents, like have they pleased their fundraising chairman? But I think this is the kind of perversion that we've allowed to evolve into inside.
Well, I'll have you know, I had one person reach out to me after seeing the screening, and they're watching today, and They said, I didn't know Congress did as much fundraising as they do. I can't tell you how angry this makes me.
Yeah.
I want to go, Raphael wrote
Well,
in.
just on that, to Andrew, I think you're going to get a really good response to this film. I think it is so credible. A lot of times when you see films, and even I remember when I was doing the interviews, I kind of didn't know where it was coming from and how it was going to portray things, but it's really credible. It's really realistic. And I think you're going to get a great response. And to that very first question here of, okay, you've told us about it. What can we do? We should be ready for that. We should make sure that we are really well equipped to send people in different places where they can help and get engaged after this film. And we should do a lot of sharing it around the country, because it's these kinds of discussions that are the first step to actually changing things. Sorry, Ben.
No. I want to go to Raphael writes in on a question. One of the solutions the film advocates is a constitutional convention to address these issues. But obviously, these issues are deeper than just thinking about how we reform our political system. Knowing that, how do we address some of the deeper sociological, economic, cultural issues we have in our country? And one example he cites is the urban and rural divide in this country. How do we address those?
Well,
Go ahead, Andrew, sorry.
Go ahead, Kahlil, please.
I'm going to go technical, and then I'm going to go bigger anthropological. On a technical level, the thing that's killing us right now are closed primaries, sore loser laws, lack of access to the ballot for independent candidates, all these things that basically mean someone like Justin Amash as an independent is not going to get elected. And the pool of people who will run is too small. Someone asked the question, how can we have 160 million voters come out but still have this much division? The reason is because everybody's going either through the Democratic or Republican primary, and the incentives in the primary are to get the next person out, no matter what, negative ads, no matter what you have to do, not the most people out. And so those primary systems, which were an innovation created in the 60s, which is supposed to open things up, are killing us right now. On a larger point, and this is what FixUS is about, it's about trust. It's about restoring the trust in our institutions. It's about listening to people at the community level, as David Brooks is writing. It's about being creative and open about whether or not we can do things. And on an idea of a constitutional convention, when you think about the organizations that are advocating for it, they're taking it very seriously. They're moving into that mode of thought, not thinking about it as something that is such an innovation that we haven't seen before. We've done it in this country. They are opportunities to allow people to speak who haven't in a long time, and they're innovations that need to be put on the table. But we're better off if we're going into that level of conversation and fix with a higher level of trust in each other, our leaders and institutions, than we have now.
I have to say one thing I love about the film, and Andrew, I have to give you kudos to this, is to me it felt like going back to civics class, but the type of civics class you really enjoy, because I don't think most people remember the lesson in civics about an Article 5 convention or the different ways to get engaged. So I think that's just such a great part of the film.
I would say it was brave to include it in the film. I mean, I completely support the movement, and I think it, for some changes, is the essential thing to make those changes happen. But there's such a concerted effort by the insiders on both the left and the right to resist it. Even, my friend Robert Reich slanders the idea of an Article 5 convention regularly, saying it's the most dangerous idea that there is in American politics. All that's crazy talk, but it kind of shows the lack of trust of the elite for the people. I remember once having a discussion and, pushing this idea, and the pushback, this was before the 2016 election, pushback was, yeah, maybe this is not dangerous, but we'll just, Hillary Clinton will be elected. She'll appoint 3 justices to the Supreme Court. We'll get the jurisprudence we want. And that just drove me crazy, because the idea that we rely on the legal elites to give us the Constitution we want, as opposed to a process that tries to bring people into the fight and to get people to talk about what values they want their Constitution to embody, is a measure of how cynical we've become about the idea of constitutional democracy. So I completely support it, but I know there are people who are going to attack the film because it talks about this, quote, dangerous idea so openly.
Just,
Thank you for that. And I'm sorry, I just wanted to say that what you finished with there was my exact feeling, that when people are attacking the idea of a constitutional convention, or even those that just blindly kind of support it as the cure-all, and they miss that what we're really talking about is getting an overwhelming majority of people all across this country behind something. That's what would have to happen for a constitutional convention to be held, not just some small cabal of state legislatures that's going to rewrite the Constitution. There would have to be, for it to be anything to be ratified, you'd need an overwhelming majority of people. And to miss that, that's what you want to do. You want to start a movement. And that's what people miss who attack it. And we did invite, Common Cause to speak in the film. We made it as easy as possible for them to participate, but because there was a possibility that we might not show it in the light that they wanted to, they refused from the top down to participate, to say whatever they would say.
Larry mentioned something that just brought up probably one of the biggest fears I have about this moment, which is the new sense that there are so many people on both sides who are rejecting the processes and systems of decision-making on which we have relied in this country to get to outcomes, because they so completely believe that their outcome is right. And we are in a moment of absolute certitude about our different beliefs of, if there's something that you think is so right, there's no room for compromise or trust in using the basic systems of democracy to think through it. I'm very worried that we're going to start compromising those systems. And so I think about the small amounts of reforms we need to do to engender more trust, to avoid the big blow up of trying to circumvent the processes that we've organized ourselves by, which sort of keep order and healthy decision-making and compromise. I think we're going to see more of that in the coming years. And I think it's going to be a big issue between kind of different approaches for coming out to the resolutions people want.
Before we wrap up, there's a couple of questions I've received. Andrew, if folks want to get involved, share the film, host a screening, we'll send out the website. What else can they do?
Yeah, the website provides easy methods of just getting in touch and about hosting a screening. Certainly, we try and make that as easy as we can. So just we are unrepresented.com is the website. You'll find our contact information on there. There's a form to have a screening, and also there's links for various organizations like CRFB in the film and others that participated in the film, to learn more about them and find movements that are a fit for what you believe. So.
Thanks,
and then
Andrew.
there's also in March of next year, we'll be starting a nationwide PBS screening. So you'll have the opportunity to view it on your local PBS station in the first quarter of this year.
Thanks, Andrew. And that's great news about PBS. I just dropped a link in the chat, and in the follow-up materials, we'll make sure folks have the link to Unrepresented and FixUS. Look, this is 2020, I don't think is a year that anyone will ever call their favorite. It's between everything that's gone on. So I feel it's important we end on an optimistic note. I just feel we need some optimism right now. Looking ahead, knowing the challenges we've discussed, knowing the movements that are out there, what are each of you optimistic about and why? Who wants to go first?
I'll go first. And it's when Larry started and said, it's the best of times, the worst of times. It's best of times because there was so much focus on really seeing the need for reforms. That is, of course, connected to the worst of times, which is things are so bad that we desperately need these reforms. But it's sort of this moment of, I don't think we've hit rock bottom, but we're hurtling towards it awfully quickly. And so what changes is that going to bring? And I believe in the ability of citizens and engaged and connected citizens to bring about those changes. For me, there's another element in all of this, which we haven't discussed much, but is what I think is contributing more than anything, which is the influence of technology in the negative downside of technology. And technology is not a negative in and of itself. There's many, many positives that we could use. But I think as we start to understand the role that that is playing, and as I mentioned, it's frictionless, it spreads mistruth so much more easily, it changes the way that we process information, we lose impulse control and filtering, changes how we interact with each other. I think we're reaching a point where we're seeing how unhealthy that is. And the fix for that is reconnecting on a very personal level and probably a very local level. And so the optimism that I see is I think there's going to be building a lot of different networks. Zoom opens up remarkable ability to connect with people so that we can have diverse discussions across the country, not just in our bubbles. But I think the resurgence of community and engagement through that and through different kinds of discussions of topics, trying to come to resolutions, gives me a lot of excitement and hope. I think we can bring about real change from starting at the bottom with the personal connections.
So I'm going to do prediction and hope, and they're going to be wrapped up together. Prediction one, you're going to see a very silly but dangerous conversation around secession happening once Joe Biden is inaugurated on January 20th. That movement will be put down swiftly and aggressively and will not find any quarter outside of a small fringe group of people. We're going to be looking for, prediction two, continued green shoots of bipartisanship. Maya and I are bathed in this movement. And we have talked a whole lot about how over the last years, bipartisanship has not existed. As a matter of fact, it tended to poll very low. There's going to be a comeback on things like national service, debt reduction, continued COVID relief, infrastructure. There are places where this conversation can happen over the next 2 years. And I think some of it will be grasped at. There'll be some missed opportunities, but that's a building block. And what we saw from the Problem Solvers Caucus was all to the good. And I think Evan McMullin wrote an interesting op-ed where he talks about whether or not homeless, never Trump Republicans should, at this point, form a new party. I think that conversation is going to be robust and interesting. I think the conversation among progressives who will be immediately dissatisfied with Q1 and Q2 decisions by the new Democratic administration, those things are actually healthy and they are useful as a renewal for both the ideological standpoint and our structure around our political dialogue. And what it will yield in the midterms are new candidates who are fighting for their point of view, hopefully a lot of whom are grounded in a truth that we can all acknowledge, and who want to support the institutions, as Maya was talking about, as opposed to tearing them down.
And I'll jump on the point of bipartisanship or nonpartisanship. I think that the hope right now, and as I've seen it through making the film, is that more people are getting behind the need to change our election processes so they are less partisan, that we need open primaries and we need ranked choice voting, anti-gerrymandering, and all of those movements have made terrific strides across the country in the last 4 years. Not as rapidly as some would like to see, but they have won successes across the country. And I think that movement, as we're all dissatisfied, has more chance to build supporters from all walks, and people are listening if you know how to speak to them. Yes, to Maya's point, there's a lot of media out there that makes it easier to hear fewer viewpoints and just be reinforced in what you're thinking. But as our political systems continues to fail us, as we, I think, all expect it's going to fail in many ways, the opportunity is to put in place primarily, I think, in the election process, new systems or reforms that will allow better representatives to come around in the next decade.
Yeah, I'm very brief. 12 years ago when I got into this movement, most of these issues were not generally understood. Now they are. I mean, not because of the work of any one group, but because of the work of many different groups. So it's all second nature, taken for granted, commonplace. Both the unrepresentativeness of our democracy and also a point that Maya was just making, the incredibly destructive contribution that the infrastructure of media is making to the capacity of our democracy. These are 2 points that it's incredibly important for us to understand if we're going to make progress, and the vast majority of people get it. Now the question is whether we can do something with it. And that's challenging, especially given the problem of media, that's challenging. And the problem of party, as Kahlil was pointing to, that's challenging. But to be at a place where basically everybody sees what the problem is, and then be able to leverage the extraordinary innovation that comes from 300 million people understanding what a problem is, that's hopeful. There's a reason to be hopeful, and that's what I am. I mean, my brand is supposed to be pessimism, but I'm finding, 2020 has been a good year for me. I'm the pessimistic brand, but I'm not convinced. I think we have a real shot here, not in the next 6 months of this next administration, but I think over the next 6 years, absolutely.
Well, that is a great note to end on. Andrew Rodney, Maya MacGuineas, Lawrence Lessig, Kahlil, Byrd, thank you so much. The film is Unrepresented. In the email materials and follow-up materials, we'll send you some links about where you can view the film and some information about FixUS and where you can get involved. Once again, let me just say thank you to our panelists for an excellent discussion. And on behalf of everyone at the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget and FixUS, we hope you have a happy, safe, and healthy holiday season and a joyful new year. Take care, everyone, and thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.